I want to get things started by asking you, Mr. President, to kick things off. You've been talking about precision medicine since 2005, but a lot of us are still new to it. So could you fill us in on the background and what brings us here today?
Well, this is an incredibly exciting time in medicine generally and the biological sciences. And a lot of this traces back to the incredible progress that we've made with the human genome. Oops, I'm sorry, my mic. I've got to talk with a mic. We've made much progress when it comes to the audio sciences. Let me start again. This is an extraordinarily exciting time for medicine and the biological sciences, and a lot of this traces back to the work that was done in mapping out the human genome, which was an enormous endeavor. There's some people here in the room who were involved in that process, including our own head of the NIH, Francis Collins. And at the time, it was enormously expensive for us to do that. With the advance of computers, big data, we are now seeing a rapid acceleration in making that process cheaper. It is spurring on a whole new set of understandings about how diseases operate, how the human body, how cells operate, how areas like cancer show that each cancer may be unique, even if it's in the same organ. And so all these insights promise the possibility of us being able to cure diseases that up until now we couldn't figure out. We could oftentimes, with real blunt instruments, treat, but it was very ineffective, or in some cases at least inefficient. And what we're now seeing is the possibility of us identifying diseases, targeting them, individualizing treatments for a particular patient, and operating with the kind of precision that promises to reduce costs, provide much better care, make our entire healthcare system much more effective. And the key to all this is for us to be able to build up databases, and because all of us potentially could have electronic medical records that voluntarily, with strong privacy protections, we pool together so that researchers, practitioners, scientists can share, we may be able to accelerate the process of discovering cures in ways that we've never seen before. And our precision medicine initiative has been designed to get all these various building blocks brought together so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So that, for example, the VA, which has been gathering genomic data on a large number of our men and women who have served this country in order to serve them better within the VA system, can they then connect with researchers at a particular university who are focused on a particular disease? And can we use big data to accelerate the research process much more rapidly? Those kinds of opportunities are there, and the good news is that over the course of the last year that we made this announcement about PMI, or Precision Medicine Initiative, what we've seen is huge interest from the private sector, from the public sector, from the non-for-profit sector, from the medical community, from researchers. And today, what we're able to announce is that 40 more organizations, or a large number of other organizations, are joining us in this process. There are a whole new set of initiatives that are going to help to drive this even faster. And my hope is that this becomes the foundation, the architecture, whereby 10 years from now we can look back and say that we have revolutionized medicine in areas like cancer or Alzheimer's, or some of the diseases that cause so much pain and suffering for so many families all across the country. And there's no better place to do it than the United States of America, where innovation and R&D has been the hallmark of driving not only our economy, but the improvements that we've seen in life expectancy and the quality of life for people all around the world.
Thank you. I want to go now, please. So I want to start by talking about some successes we've had from people on the panel in the realm of precision medicine, and then go to some of the challenges that we face moving forward. Starting with Sonia, so several years ago, your mother was diagnosed with a rare prion disease and passed away. The disease is known as fatal familial insomnia. You have essentially devoted your life to making that name obsolete. You chose to get tested yourself for the gene. How have you been motivated to be so proactive?
It's a great question. I would say deciding to get tested once I learned that my mom had died of a genetic disease and that I was at 50-50 risk of inheriting the same fate, which was midlife onset, very rapid neurodegenerative decline. These diseases are always fatal. They are currently untreatable. Once I had that knowledge in my hand, and these decisions were all made hand in hand with my husband, Eric, who's here today. For the two of us, the decision to pursue testing and resolve that doubt was clear. We made that decision instantaneously because we knew there was no going back to a time before we knew about our risk. So we wanted to know what we were up against. What I couldn't have predicted is what would happen next. So as you mentioned, I'd been trained as a lawyer. Eric had been trained as a city planner and an engineer. And I don't think either of us went into the test with a vision of how it was going to change our lives one way or the other. But when we came out with that positive test report, my life broke into two pieces, right? There was before and there was after. And what happened after is that we set about trying to learn everything we could about these diseases. And, like everyone looking for answers, we started with Google. We started with Wikipedia. We read what we could find on the internet. We read papers. We called up researchers out of the blue. Some of them were kind enough to take our calls. We started attending conferences. We started blogging. And eventually we changed jobs. And 4 years later, we're both PhD students at Harvard Medical School. And day to day, we work side by side in Stuart Schreiber's lab at the Broad Institute in Cambridge. And there we're devoting ourselves to developing treatments for these diseases. I'm so proud to be doing this, but I have to say we've been just immensely lucky. The Broad Institute has basically adopted us. We have had some brilliant people take risks on us, like Eric Lander, who advises the president on science, sometimes advises us too. Amazingly. But even with the best people backing us, there is no guarantee that we will be successful in my lifetime, right? We are running this race day by day, and we still have to see where it takes us. I would say, in terms of redefining the disease, as you mentioned, the diagnosis that was handed to me was fatal familial insomnia, and that's like this particular genetic variant in the prion protein gene has acquired that clinical designation over the years. So that name was given to it in a time when we didn't know what was at the root of these diseases. What we knew was what doctors saw in the clinic. So some genetic prion diseases were named for symptoms like insomnia that some patients have, honestly, and some don't. And some genetic prion diseases were named for the doctors who observed these symptoms. But I think it's symbolic of the era that we're in now, that I think we can rename these diseases on the basis of what they are. So now we know the molecular mechanism of our disease. This is like our greatest weapon. Like, we're coming in knowing what our enemy is. We have molecular resolution on our target. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by clinging to names that obscure the mechanism of these diseases and the things that unite patients with quote unquote different diseases that have flown under different names for many decades. So I think of us as patients with genetic prion disease, and I think that is the patient cohort that I identify with, and those are the people who I want to help.
So while you're studying a disease that affects 100 people worldwide, you're also studying this entire mechanism that can tie into many diseases as people continue to share their data and their experience.
Absolutely.
I know that you're supposed to go next, but I'm going to hijack this just for 1 second. We're in my house. But there's something that I should have mentioned that Sonia's story, I think, highlights, and that is so often what we label as a healthcare system is actually more of a disease care system in which the patient is passive. You wait until you get sick. A bunch of experts then help you solve it. And one of the promises of precision medicine is not just identifying or giving researchers and medical practitioners tools to help cure people. It is also empowering individuals to monitor and take a more active role in their own health. Now, in Sonia's case, obviously, there's a very particular genetic variant that she's got to worry about. And, the extraordinary strength and tenacity that she brings to this makes me really optimistic that she's going to help drive for a cure in this particular area. But for many people who may not have such a clear, specific concern, you may still have genetic variants that alter how you think about your blood pressure, your likelihood for diabetes, a whole range of other potential markers that if we get this right, if we do precision medicine well, and we get that information, that data to consumers, gives them the ability to stay healthy for long periods of time, and that's hugely promising. And it's good for those individuals. It's good for society generally because it will save on a whole lot of healthcare costs if we can prevent diseases from manifesting themselves in the first place. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's
but it's an important point.
It's a perfect segue to Howard, who is working not just as a patient advocate. Your own daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, but in terms of data sharing, you have worked to create a platform for data sharing, and you recently built for your daughter a pancreas, which is especially impressive for someone with no training in the medical sciences. How did you manage that?
No training required. It turns out I'm a geek dad. And when my daughter was diagnosed in 2011, the first thing I realized was, wow, here are these medical devices, a continuous glucose monitor that measures her blood glucose every 5 minutes, an insulin pump that delivers a deadly hormone, which you walk this tightrope when you have type 1 diabetes of just a little too much insulin, and you can have a seizure or go into a coma, or even 1 in 20 people, unfortunately, will die over the course of their lifetime from nocturnal hypoglycemia or too much insulin while they sleep. And what I realized was we just couldn't get the data out of the devices easily enough. Each device came with its own proprietary software, and it was just too hard to get the data out. It's kind of like, imagine you bought a digital camera and you had to use the software that came with the camera in order to view your pictures, right? It was like that. Right. And so we founded a company called Tidepool, which is open source and nonprofit, and a bunch of other people also built open source efforts. There was a gentleman named John Kostick who reverse engineered that continuous glucose monitor so that we could read data off of that device, and another gentleman named Ben West who reverse engineered the insulin pump. And there are other people. Dana Lewis is here with her open APS, artificial pancreas system. And this community came together and wrote software that allows those decisions, those precise decisions about insulin delivery to be made in software. So now I put one of these together for my daughter. There are many other people who put it together for themselves. And what it means is that she gets those precise doses of insulin in a much safer and much more effective way. So basically what happened is by liberating the data from the device, we were able to come up with a much better way to deliver therapy. And I think it just shows the power of engaged patients and how important it is to liberate the data, not just electronic health record data, but also device data, right? Patients with type 1 diabetes shouldn't have to outsmart the very companies that they depend on for these life-saving devices, and I think that's what we've seen the community do.
And I want to move to Dr. Linehan. You have been for decades doing research in renal cancers, and when you trained as a urological surgeon, there was only one disease, kidney cancer, had the same treatment, and you came in and said that this isn't working. These are different diseases, half of which you've basically discovered yourself. You were doing precision medicine before it was cool. What led you to that? What was your moment of saying something needs to change?
It was very easy in a way. So as you said, I'm a urologic surgeon, and so if a patient comes to someone like me with a small kidney tumor, we can cure 95% of those patients. But if they came certainly 34 years ago when we started with advanced disease, 82% of them died within 24 months. So I said, we've got to do something about this. So we decided to try and identify the gene. We thought it was a gene for kidney cancer. We had no idea what a mountain this would be to climb. And so we started out to look for the gene for kidney cancer. There was no Human Genome Project at the time. It took us 10 years to find our first gene. We worked on one thing for 10 years to find that. We now know that kidney cancer is not kidney cancer. It's a number of different types of cancer that just happen to occur in that organ. They look different under the microscope. They have very different courses. Some are very indolent, some are very aggressive. And they respond differently to therapy, and we know they're caused by different genes. And we use that now in our management of patients all the time. I'll give you an example. We started with studying patients who had kidney cancer. And again, as I said, it was very difficult. There was no technology to really do it at the time. So we started studying families with rare forms of kidney cancer. And our hope was that those genes would be the main genes for the non-inherited kidney cancer. That turned out to be the case. For our first gene is the main gene for the non-hereditary main type of kidney cancer. But I'll give you one example. We saw a young lady came up from a young woman came up from Charlottesville, an 18-year-old, and she had a big kidney tumor. She came up with her mom, and I took out that kidney and that tumor on May 23rd, 1989. And even with our surgery, we still lost her. She died on February 1st, 1990, 7 months later. And her mom died 14 months after that of kidney cancer. It ran in the family. It took us 18 years to figure out actually what she had. We now know what that is. We now know that gene. We now know that disease. We manage those patients very differently than we manage patients, excuse me, with other types of kidney cancer. So I saw a woman yesterday who was a very nice woman, 42 years of age. She and her husband went to, she had a very large kidney tumor, went to a very well-known medical center in the South, and they looked at that and they said, gee, that's a big kidney tumor, and that tumor has spread to her liver and to different parts of her abdomen. And they said, we don't think surgery's going to help here, and there's not a lot we can do to help you. And actually, then they contacted us because they knew we had an interest in this. And we saw this lady, and we agonized over what to do. And we decided to go ahead and do surgery, even though we knew we couldn't get all the tumor out. But we had seen people like this do well. So we did that, and we took out a lot of tumor, but there was still a lot of tumor left in her liver and different things. She's now about 16 weeks on therapy targeting we know the cancer gene that causes her cancer, that runs in her family. And yesterday we saw her, and we couldn't find any cancer on her in the X-rays. I'm not saying that this won't recur, and I'm not saying we don't have miles to go before we sleep, but we are really encouraged by this, and we're encouraged we're seeing with the other types of kidney cancers. The first gene that we identified, that pathway, the FDA has now approved 7 drugs that target that cancer gene pathway. Now, again, we've got a lot of work to do, and I couldn't practice medicine really without what we now call precision medicine. I really couldn't do it. It helps us decide what operation to do, whether to do an operation or not, what drug to give. But most importantly, our real goal is prevention, and the president mentioned this. Once we understand the genes, the pathways, then we ought to, well, we hope we'll be able to prevent those. And so it is incalculable to us what this has meant to how we manage these patients. And it's had a huge effect on what surgeries we do, certainly what drugs we do. The drugs that we gave this lady we saw yesterday are known in my field not to work on kidney cancer. But I say to them, look, these are different diseases. This is a different type of kidney cancer. So I think we've got a great future ahead.
When you talk about prevention, is there an example, immunologic therapy, CRISPR, are we talking about how we could keep that gene from being expressed or actually remove the gene? Is there an example of how that might work?
Well, there's a number of potential strategies like that, but what I was really thinking about here was understanding that pathway. And then, for example, if we could get to the day, and I say this to patients every week, you know, that we're not giving up, we're not stopping until we got a way to prevent this, and to have, I'd say a nice lady like you, that we could give, if we had a 21-year-old, we could give a pill and say, you take this pill for a month a year and call us if you need us. So that's one strategy.
And so what we have found here is that what we thought to be one disease, even in the 1980s, is how many diseases?
Well, we know of at least 16 different types for sure
At least
that cause
16.
this, at
And
least.
it
And we have more genes to find.
Yeah, I mean, could it go into the thousands? Is every tumor going to be its own individual?
Well, I think, well, we'll have to see, but I think so. I think every different tumor is, I don't want to say is going to be a fight to the death, each one, but just about. I mean, each gene pathway for the different cancers could potentially have a different strategy. So we say to ourselves and to our patients, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
So the question that raises in my mind then is, how does that not become an exorbitant cost when pharmaceutical companies need to move away from a drug that can treat many people to drugs that are treating small groups of people, just as a matter of scale and production, research and development?
Well, what the doctor is identifying, I think, is the fact that we're just in the infancy of all this. We're just beginning to understand at the molecular level, at the genetic level, what exactly is happening in various diseases. And the goal of the Precision Medicine Initiative is to figure out how to break down some of the structural or institutional barriers that prevent us from making the big leaps over the next several years. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. With respect to being able to map out what's happening with these different diseases and what are the genetic similarities, what are the differences, why are some people doing okay with it, why are people not? The more samples we have, the more data we have, the more we're going to be able to learn. Part of the problem we have right now is that every patient's data is siloed. It's in a hospital here, a hospital there, a doctor here, a lab there. And so the goal here is if we can pool and create a common database of ultimately 1 million people that's diverse, so that they have a lot of genetic variation. We can now take a disease that may be relatively rare, but because we have a pretty large sample size and start seeing patterns that we might not have seen before. But a couple things that requires. It requires, first of all, us understanding who owns the data. Right? And I would like to think that if somebody does a test on me or my genes, that's mine. But that's not always how we define these issues, right? So there's some legal issues involved. In terms of the model that we use for health records that hopefully will be digitalized more and more, companies help hospitals keep and collect that data, and they should get paid for that. It's, they're building software, they're building an infrastructure. On the other hand, we don't want that data just trapped. So if I am sick and voluntarily I want to join with other people who have a similar disease than mine and donate our data to help accelerate cures, I've got to be able to work with the electronic health record companies to make sure that I can do that easily, right? And there may be some commercial resistance to that we have to talk about, although we're seeing some terrific participation now, and that's part of what we're announcing, of those companies in terms of helping that happen. There's privacy issues. We've got to figure out how do we make sure that if I donate my data to this big pool, that it's not going to be misused, that it's not going to be commercialized in some way that I don't know about. And so we've got to set up a series of structures that make me confident that if I'm making that contribution to science, that I'm not going to end up getting a bunch of spam, targeting people who have a particular disease I may have. And so across the board, what we're trying to do is just make sure that all the various players in the healthcare system, including the researchers themselves, are invested in us building this broader capacity. Because this can potentially also change how we do research. Right now, what happens is the best researchers and the best universities, oftentimes, they're kind of hoarding their samples because apparently, I'm not a researcher, but that's
Never too late, Mr. President.
Yeah. Good point. It's a good point. I don't think I'm as smart as you are, so the transition may be difficult. But
you could try software.
Right. But my understanding is that the basic model of research at universities is having your samples. That's really valuable because that's how you get grants. And on the other hand, if we've got 1 million samples that are accessible to researchers from all across the country and all around the world, and they're all able to at least shorten the lines of inquiry and collapse them so that they can eliminate those things that are less likely to work and pursue those things that are more likely to work before you start getting into the more detailed aspects of the research. That ends up being a cost saver. Now, you're identifying one last point, which is something that we got to have some big brains out here figure out. And that is the economics of treatment. Because right now, if you have a big blockbuster drug, it may work really well for this individual, not so well for that individual. In the aggregate, it works pretty well. And as a consequence, it gets prescribed a lot, and the drug company can make a lot of money. If it turns out that we start knowing that it really works well for you, but it doesn't work well for Francis is no longer buying it, and we now have a smaller group of potential customers. And so there may be some pause in terms of making that investment. And what we have to be able to do is to think about, much in the same way that we have to think about vaccines. And right now we're working, we just had a meeting about Zika, where we actually think there's a promising pathway for diagnostics and vaccines on this. It's not a real complicated virus, apparently. But how do we figure out a production cycle that makes sense? We're going to have to make some decisions, and this is where Senator Lamar Alexander, who's taking great interest in this is going to be part of the legislative process that we've got to think about. Are there ways where the government says, we step in, not to pay for every drug, but there may be areas where we subsidize drugs that are really effective for a small group of people, and there ends up being some cross-subsidies with other drugs. We create markets. There's a whole bunch of complicated questions that we're going to have to answer. The point, though, the final point I'll make is, over the long term, we can save a lot of money rather than make this more expensive if every drug we prescribe actually works. If the doctor with his kidney patient knows that this is not going to work and that's not going to work, he's not going to be wasting a huge amount of time, effort, surgery, et cetera, on a path that's less likely to succeed. He's going to be saving money and focusing entirely on those pathways that we know are going to work. So,
Can I piggyback on that and note that CDC announced last month that 47,000 Americans died in 2014 of drug overdoses, the majority of which were opioids. That number has doubled since 2000. Do you see a role for precision medicine in addressing that, what they're calling an epidemic?
well, it's a complicated question. Part of the problem that we have with the opioid epidemic is that in 85% of rural communities, we don't have mental health or drug treatment facilities. So I want to make sure people understand precision medicine is not a replacement for making sure people have just basic health care. And we have to make sure that that's still in place. But we don't yet know the genetic basis for addiction, for example, in ways that we may discover 10 years from now or 15 years from now. And so it could end up having an impact. I think short term, the opioid problem really has more to do with the fact that a lot of people don't have basic health care. They put off getting help on pain management. The easiest way to do it initially is just to get some pills. The pills run out, and then sadly, it turns out that heroin is a cheaper way to refill your prescription, and people are getting hooked. So I think that's actually a different category of problem, but what it does speak to is the fact that the more we know about how to treat a particular problem, the more effectively we treat that problem. Over time, the more efficient and cost-effective the healthcare system will be.
Can I turn to Sonia and Howard, this will be my final question. Talking about barriers to sharing, you've both been very open advocates for donating data. How do you encourage people to donate data and feel safe about it and understand the importance, and what are the barriers to people feeling safe about that going forward?
I think it continues to be a challenge in the sense that we've come a long way. I'm so grateful to the people behind GINA and the people who are working to make sure that people with genetic variants like mine don't fear discrimination, but they still do. And I hear from patients all the time who are really concerned about even letting their PCP know that this disease runs in their family. It's tricky with a disease where the phenotype is sort of lurking. They don't have a health problem right now, and they kind of want to coast and hide among the general healthy population as long as they can. And what I hope to convey to people when we talk about this is the sooner we don't have a treatment now. But the sooner they become plugged into a system that is working on one, I think the better for everyone, right? Having baseline data about what is your particular body like today will help enormously down the road if we have a treatment and want to ask, is it making a difference? Or if they think they're having onset and they think their disease is beginning. And, you know, in rare diseases, I think we depend so much, all research depends so much on patient participants. In rare diseases, every person who comes forward to participate is like a quantum leap in the amount of data we have. So I hope that we keep working on the sort of legal framework behind celebrating patients who come forward. And I think we're headed in the right direction.
So in the type 1 diabetes world, fortunately, finding people who are willing to donate their data is not a problem. There are plenty of people who say, I'm in. Just tell me how to do it, and you can have my data because it's for the greater good. The challenge is really twofold. One is with both device makers and also cloud service providers who house the data, there's this fear where they may say, well, we don't know what people are going to do with the data, and we're worried about the liability if that data gets out. So I think one thing we can do is just make it very clear that by publishing your data protocols, you're not accepting any new liability. It is up to the people who take that data downstream to make sure they're using it in a safe, effective way. Another challenge, and this is an easily fixed one, is just making the interfaces available. Device companies could publish the data and control protocols for their devices, and cloud service providers can use very simple, well-known APIs, application programming interfaces. The President and I are both wearing our Fitbits today, right? There are APIs that let us pull our Fitbit data. There should be APIs just like that that let us pull our diabetes data. These are very solvable problems.
One last thought from
Yeah,
Dr.
you know,
Linehan.
you mentioned, actually, the president mentioned about things like tissue banks and things. My assistant the other day said to me, said, Dr. Linehan, she said, you work with 140 people on this kidney, from 29 different labs and branches at the NIH, at the National Institutes of Health. And over the years, our approach has always been the same, that you shouldn't be surprised the progress people can make working together if you're not quite so concerned about who gets credit for the work. And I think that and that's always, you know, you get so tied up. And then, but we all think, those of us in science or those clinicians, all think, why'd we go in this field in the first place? It was to help patients. And then you got involved in all these things about promotions and who knows what, publications or something. But the leadership comes from the top. The good news is we have great leadership. The leadership comes from the top. And I think we can change the culture. It's going to take a little bit of that, but we can do it.
And just one of the charges I've given all the federal agencies working together on this is looking at the regulatory framework we have that was designed for another era of medicine and making sure we update it. And that's where I think the work that we do with Congress can be very important here, and there's good bipartisan support for how we think about this. So for example, we've got a new FDA commissioner, Robert Cardiff. Congratulations, doctor. But you know, the FDA traditionally has thought about protecting the public health in terms of these are medical devices and these are drugs, and you know, there are certain categories, and here's certain protocols that we go through. And when it comes to gathering data, disseminating data, making sure it's accurate and valid, figuring out how it's communicated to the patient or the individual who's interested in it. Sometimes we're fitting square pegs into round holes, and we may have to reconceptualize how we think about this to open up this space. When I mentioned researchers earlier, well, part of the reason that people are worried about getting credit is because research dollars and grants flow in the direction of who gets credit. And so rethinking how we design, you know, the NIH and other agencies redesign their grant making to encourage collaboration rather than siloing. That's going to be important, right? So there's going to be a whole range of areas where We may need new safeguards, for example, in terms of privacy and security of the data that's being disseminated. There may be other areas where we need to break down regulations that might have applied and made sense in another era of medicine but aren't going to apply now. And that's the kind of evaluation that we're doing, because ultimately this is going to be successful because everybody in this process starts rowing in the same direction. You know, this won't work unless we have the private sector coming up with innovation. And that includes the drug companies, and that includes, you know, manufacturers of, you know, ultimately something that's just tracking your heart rate may be able to track a whole bunch of other stuff that is giving you a constant flow of information on a daily basis to keep you healthier. We want to encourage that kind of innovation, and we don't want to have bureaucracy stand in the way of that. On the other hand, we also know that there's going to be possibilities for abuse, and really making sure that we have private sector providers, researchers, doctors, academics, government officials, agencies, all figuring out what's the basic architecture and having an open mind about continually updating it, modifying it. If we get this right now, and this includes, by the way, the cancer moonshot that Vice President Biden is initiating, because a lot of the progress is going to be in this same space, making sure that we're all working in the same direction. If we do that, I'm confident that, at least for Malia and Sasha's generation, they're going to be able to make progress in ways and live healthier lives in ways that we could not imagine.
That's all our time. Can we give a round of applause to the panelists?